And today on the show, I'm joined by two guests. I'm joined by Tammy Rimes, procurement consultant and executive director at National Cooperative Procurement Partners, which is a professional association for cooperative procurement, and also by Rick Bond. Rick is the chief revenue officer at Safeware, a leader in safety and security solutions, and a member of a number of cooperative contracting organizations. I invited Tammy and Rick on the show to talk more about the world of cooperative and collaborative contracting, and then to talk specifically about how that helps procurement teams maintain their agility when responding to safety issues. With that intro said, Tammy, Rick, thanks for joining me and welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invite.
Right. I'm very excited. Thank you
Yeah,
for having us.
let's do this. All right. So the first question that I always ask, typically of a procurement guest that's on the show, so I'm going to direct this to you, Tammy, is did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Procurement found me, and you'll find that with most procurement
Yes.
professionals, we all kind of fell into the profession. Actually, I formerly worked for the city of San Diego, and my goal was to be a city manager. So I worked different departments to get that operational backgrounds. But my last position with the city was as purchasing agent for my
Mhm.
last 5 years. And I always share with people it was my most difficult, but most favorite job I ever had because procurement is part of everything
Yeah.
happening within the operations.
Yeah. I always found that when I look back on my career, the the hardest jobs were my favorite too, because the
Yeah.
impact that you can and there's so much complexity and problem solving,
You're always problem
every single
solving, yeah.
day,
Every
which is
single day. You come in thinking you know what your schedule is for
right.
the day. Oh, no, that's not your schedule.
It's
Somebody
true.
the phone is gonna ring, and you've got a whole new, operation going.
Yeah, it's stressful in the moment, but it's, rewarding when you look back on it.
You're never bored.
I and Rick, I'm sure you're never bored either. And can you talk a little bit about your experience with first responders and public safety?
Well, just starting with the first responders, about half the work we do here is with the end user customers. So we work with fire, we work with police, we work with public health departments. And so we're kind of in a unique position where about 90% of our customers are with state and local government.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's different for us is that we discovered many years ago that most of my customers have no money, no money, no money,
Yeah.
and then they have $112,000 they got to spend by Thursday at 5 o'clock. And that's the way government tends to work, right?
Mhm.
It's when it happens hard and fast at the end of the fiscal year, into the grant performance period. So, if you don't already have a contract, it's very difficult to execute. And so we found this, incredible tool, which we'll talk about in terms of cooperative contracts to make sure that we had already established our pricing and our products with the decision makers across the country. So, but yeah, we're super proud of what we do. Every once in a while, we're watching the news and it's, hey, we know those guys. We work with them, so it's pretty cool.
So you end up working with a lot of first responders then, and you're kind of being very reactive to a situation that evolves quickly, and then you need to get boots on the ground or supplies or materials and things like that. So it's hard to kind of project when that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the emergency business, right?
Yeah.
So emergencies for them are just another day at the office. So it also turns into some kind of a disruption for the purchasing folks when they come barreling in and throw a piece of paper on the desk and say, "Hey, I need to buy this. It's
Mhm.
$83,000. The money expires Thursday at 5 o'clock." And the purchasing folks are like, "Okay, it just doesn't work that way. We can't
Yeah.
just buy whatever we
Yeah.
want. Just you think it's a great idea." But yeah, I mean, it's dynamic. Sometimes we're dealing with an emergency, when it's emergent, when it's actually happening. But, even when people are preparing, just because of the way the money flows, it is very dynamic. So I'm another person that doesn't have too many boring days in the
Mhm.
office. I can
I
promise you
bet.
that.
Um, yeah, just so that we're kind of aligned on terminology, Tammy, I wonder if you could just talk about what is a cooperative
Sure.
contract? And actually, we used cooperative and collaborative, both those contracts, kind of
Right.
interchangeable. I'm not sure if they really are interchangeable. So if you could just talk a little bit about both of those.
Sure, happy to share. So there's actually a couple of examples. So one is when a bunch of entities, usually in a geographical location, will bond together their spend and go out with an RFP or bid with the anticipation that a supplier is going to be responding not only to serve the entity who issued the RFP, but all of the other entities who are on board. So for instance, I did this at the city for my fuel contract. I was going out to bid, but I contacted all the other agencies around me and said, hey, do you want to piggyback and be part of this? And they did. So we ended up having 17 agencies go out with an RFP for fuel. That's one example.
Yeah.
The second example, and this is what we're going to be talking about through this podcast, is when an agency or an organization, a cooperative organization, does that same government bid process, and the resulting contract is now piggybackable. It has language within it that other entities across a region or the nation can now use and make purchases immediately. The solicitation process has been done, but it's been done by somebody else. And now you as a using agency still may need to do a little bit of due diligence, make sure it checks all the right boxes for your agency. But these contracts are available and ready to go, particularly for emergencies. They're a great resource.
How often do you find that other agencies piggyback off, the contracts that another agency has put in place with a provider versus kind of going to market themselves and going through the whole process? Is this something that's kind of a normal business practice? Or is the first response usually, oh no, I've got to go and find a supplier. And, I'm going to go out and Google for a supplier and see what I can find and quickly put a contract in place.
Yeah, usually in emergencies, particularly when you're working with police and fire, they usually know what they want, or they have an idea of what they want. And sometimes they even want the certain company that they want. And now it's up to procurement to figure that out through the contracting process. So if it's an emergency, that bid process can take weeks and months. We don't have time for that. That's where the cooperatives come in. It also is successful. So for instance, maybe my fire chief wants to work with Rick from Safeware. Well, I can't put a bid out of the street and say, okay, Rick, only you and Safeware can respond to my bid. But I can reach out to Rick and say, hey, do you have a cooperative contract or a state contract that I can look at? I can piggyback on that possibly. And now my fire chief is very happy because I'm getting him the company and the resources he wants.
Yeah. So Rick, as a provider, how do you see collaborative and cooperative contracts? Is that something that's that helps you as an organization? Or you see as it's you're lowering your leverage because you're dealing with multiple different providers all grouping up as one, rather than to sell to each one of them individually?
Right. I mean, you kind of characterized it. It's a bigger opportunity. So we're going to give up a little bit to get that opportunity, but it's enabled us to scale our business tremendously nationally in terms of having exposure to a lot more customers. So Tammy's description is spot on. It might be a large municipality that competes it, but it opens it up for not just neighboring counties and other municipalities, but folks all over the country. And in particular in public safety, and not just during emergencies, just because of the way the money moves, we find cooperative contracts are absolutely essential. And Tammy really laid it out. So in our business, it's very brand specific. They've usually taken the time to determine, hey, this is the product we want. If it's police, and I'm not being indelicate, they probably took to the range and shot it. It doesn't matter. It could be a fountain pen. They're still going to go out and shoot it. They want to see how it battle tests, right? So by that time, there's not a lot of flexibility. So aligning ourselves with the supply chain of the top manufacturers, and then aligning ourselves with the customers so that when those purchases need to take place, the customers can execute. That's been our business model, and it's worked out very, very well. But you're right, our margins have dropped significantly since we took this path. But we've grown a lot. So it's been a great business strategy for our company.
How can users, the buyers, be confident that when they enter into or leverage a contractor like this, that the contract is competitive? That because they didn't have the chance themselves to necessarily go and do a competitive bid. How do you kind of respond when you get questioned that, Rick, first of all?
Well, again, my mentors are my customers, so I can tell you what the customers do with that. First of all, big municipalities like Tammy's former employer, City of San Diego, they often do what they call market research. So they're still going to use a cooperative contract, but we're not the only supplier with a cooperative contract. So they may compare our price
Mhm.
with other suppliers who also have a co-op, it still enables them to act quickly. So you got right to the point. This is one of the big concerns that people have. The other thing I want to call out with cooperative contract, the first cooperative contract we had, which was with Fairfax County, Virginia, Kathy Muse, who was the director of purchasing there, she told me within 5 minutes of the first meeting, she said, you can always go down on the price. You can never exceed it.
Yeah.
So our customers do expect us to modify the price, based on the opportunity. So our biggest customers are our country's biggest customers.
Mhm.
And so it's a ceiling price, but it does tend to be a situation where the larger customers and many of the customers, they do want to benchmark that price, and we invite that, checking it against other contracts and that type of thing. Tammy, you work with our customers every day.
Yeah.
How do they make sure that they're getting the right price on our contract and other contracts?
Yeah, a lot of times these cooperative contracts, they are awarded at a manufacturer level, but they're serviced at a dealer or a local sales
Mhm.
rep. So me as a purchasing director, before I piggyback on anybody else's contract, it could be a cooperative, it could be a state contract, it could be another agency down the road. I still need to conduct my own due diligence. So there are a set of questions. So the first thing I'm going to want to know is, can you give me a copy of the original bid solicitation? I want to see the responses. I want to see the evaluation, the ultimate contract and the terms and conditions. Then I get into the pricing. I want to look at that pricing. Is it a ceiling price? Is it a percentage off of manufacturing? And how do I confirm that? So there's a lot of back and forth, but it's pretty quick. You can do it within hours or days and get your answers to your questions. Then I may want to augment that. For instance, if the indemnification language says, if there's any problems with this contract, we need to solve this in Minnesota where it was let. It's
Yeah.
like, no, I'm in California.
Yeah.
I'm going to change that indemnification language. So again, I may put forth an addendum. I may negotiate a little bit, but in the end, the supplier also has to agree to those changes
Yeah.
and sign off on it. So yeah, it's not just a slam dunk, put your signature on it and go. We still have to conduct some due diligence and also make sure our attorneys are happy with it as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, that cooperative contract that exists, that was put in place the first time, ultimately acts as the master, let's say the master services agreement. But then everybody who want to then call off on that contract can then put
Sure.
in place, so long as the supplier agrees and is
Right.
aligned with that, their own language that kind of builds on it, so they have something that's
Mhm.
more fit for purpose for them.
Yeah, I mean, procurement, it solves a lot of our problems as far as the timeline. It also can save a lot of money because we're leveraging the spend across a lot of clients. But in the end, we're still responsible for this contract. So if anything goes wrong, if the funding source requires, like if it's federal or grant funds that require
Mhm.
certain language to be in there, we have to still make sure those boxes are checked while we're buying whatever product is needed.
Yeah. What do you feel makes those kind of agreements successful?
Well, a professional cooperative, they have their own, they do their own due diligence to make sure they include all the proper
Yeah.
language. So they have their own attorneys. They a lot of times work with a lead agency, a government agency. So that government agency also has their own terms and conditions and rules and regulations. But let's say that contract was let off in Virginia, which is Rick's Virginia state law may be a little different than my
Mhm.
California state law. So I may have to look and make sure that it still complies with what I need.
Right. Um, I want to kind of move specifically to the field of, emergency preparation and preparedness. And um, first of all, Tammy, from your perspective, how as a procurement leader do you look at this as a category? It's one of those, as we talked about at the beginning, that um, you don't know when you're going to need to spend the money, and when you need to spend it, you need to spend it quickly. So
Right.
I'm sure there's a lot of reactiveness, but all the best strategies are proactive in nature.
Of
So when
course.
you start to approach this as a category and you think about how do I, kind of build my strategy around how to support this, where do you start?
Well, one of the good things about, and it's unfortunate to say this, about the pandemic, a good thing did come out of that in that a lot of procurement teams weren't well versed in emergency preparedness. Now, if you were from Florida or the Gulf of around Texas, yes, you handle emergencies all the time. Same with California. We got wildfires, we've got earthquakes. But across the rest of the nation, there were a lot of procurement teams that never really dealt with a big emergency. Well, the pandemic became the leveling field. Everybody got an experience with emergency preparedness and purchasing under an emergency situation. So that was a good thing in that, folks who wouldn't go to emergency training class suddenly got a fast track class in emergency. But one of the things I learned, and I actually had to deal with some major fires in California afterward, was now that I've gone through this experience, why aren't I setting up contracts in advance, knowing that California always has fires? Yeah. There will always be flooding. There will always be debris removal. So what we did after our major fire emergency was set up as needed contracts. So you can ask any entity, what's the stuff you have to buy? Everybody has to buy bottled water and food and debris removal and fencing and security and all of that. So why not set up cooperative contracts with the understanding that I could spend $0 under this contract this year, or I could spend $500,000 with this contract, but at least I've already done all my due diligence, checked all the boxes, and now this contract's sitting there ready to go. Right. So I think a lot more teams are being more proactive in that respect. If they're setting up these contracts, or they now know that cooperatives are an option for them.
Yeah, I certainly see that across all of risk and risk management, and how, I would always train on risk even before the pandemic. And, we'd tell people that, they're only willing to invest in risk when it's too late.
Right. It's always and it's unfortunately governments like that. It's sometimes we're always after the fact.
Yeah.
And people don't realize weird stuff happens during emergencies. Things so for instance, the electricity goes out. Well, most of us rely on our computers and phones, but if you got no electricity in 6 hours, you got no phones and no computers. Or the cell phone tower burned up. Now, everybody within that area, we're so used to having everything on our cell phones. So one of the lessons we learn is we need to print out hard copies of all the staff, our phone numbers, our home phone numbers. I mean, a simple thing like that, and our main suppliers. We now have printed paper lists with phone numbers and contact for our suppliers. Sometimes I had to go find a landline phone to start calling suppliers because all our cell phone towers went down during the fire. So it's a real learning lesson when you're going through an emergency.
Rick, from your perspective, how do you when an emergency happens? So you have lots of different municipalities or governments and customers who have signed up perhaps to a $0 contract, but so they can call off on things when an emergency happens. That puts a lot of the burden of risk on you, because you've got to be able to respond very quickly when an emergency happens. How do you kind of prepare to be ready to be there, once an emergency hits?
What a great question. So for us, you're absolutely right. We always say, you don't build the church for the Easter Sunday crowd, right? So it'd be wonderful if I could say, well, we're just going to fill the warehouse with everything anybody might ever need in an emergency. But, we had a call in 2021 on Easter Sunday from the state of Florida. They needed 1.5 million gallons of bleach. We didn't have 1.5 million gallons of bleach in our warehouse. Getting back to the pandemic, the needs were constantly changing, right? And the manufacturers nowadays, they work on just-in-time inventory and trying to keep their costs down. And so finding that product where it's accessible in the time of an emergency is the challenge. So, a couple of things that we do. First of all, I would say that for us, the customers that we deal with, often during the emergency, our customers are already dealing with. So we try to focus on working with customers before, during, and after an emergency. And a few years ago, I attended a conference with the National Governors Association. The FEMA administrator at that time was a guy named Brock Long. And I remember him telling a panel of our nation's governors, it's so cool, I was sitting right there, behind him, that the time to try to figure out where you're going to get water during an emergency is not when you need water when there's an emergency, which I think is kind of a rehash of what Tammy said. But there's a few things as a customer that you need to think about, and one is creating a resilient supply chain, a supply chain that can scale and expand. And I think from a purchasing standpoint, most of my customers realize, okay, we need to look at our partners and think about who's going to be there on a Saturday afternoon. One thing we do know is if there's an emergency, that chief procurement officer, just like Tammy was, they're going to be out there. So I think there's a certain amount of attention that goes into that type of purchase, but there's a lot that goes into it. A lot of times you have great local suppliers, but do they have the cash to scale up when you really need stuff? So, evaluating that supply chain, do they have contracts? Are they able to meet our needs and scale? And then thinking about these cooperative contracts or any contract, one of the big criteria is, does the language for government folks, does the language tie back to reimbursement guidelines by the United States government? So you can spend the money with somebody on a contract, and that contract may not be allowed. So I think it's something that people learn the hard way. Like Tammy said, it's a whole generation now of public procurement folks that have been through emergencies. We didn't have that before 2020 because they've all taken those calls. So I'm also curious and interested when I hear Tammy talking about it, what she hears from the public sector. Okay, what are we going to do different in the future, and how are we going to address it? But just to add one more footnote, on that day in March, that Saturday afternoon, when they opened up all the EOCs for the pandemic, my daughter, who was a college student, came home like everybody else's college student kids. By the way, they were sucking up all the bandwidth in my little house. I mean,
Yeah.
it was past that point. They're all in the house. And all of a sudden, and it wasn't just the customers, we have 35 salespeople all over the country. All of a sudden, the phone is just ringing, the text, the emails. And that was before I turned all the notifications off. So I just read them and don't hear them. So it was ding, ding, ding. I remember her looking at me and saying, "Dad, what is going on?" But, that is a real world, what happened. I mean, we have a lot of people that are working on it, but what happened during the pandemic, this chief procurement officer, the really big, really important customer, was in that EOC shoulder to shoulder with the people who are managing the crisis, the health department and all the high ranking public officials. And so all of a sudden on a weekend, we're getting calls from the most important customers we have across the country. Another thing we did, and we've done through every emergency, is stage inventory early. So we do have a mobilization plan on our own end. So when people went back and reviewed our performance during the pandemic, what did we do? We brought in millions of dollars worth of supplies. We brought them into our warehouse. And the way we distribute them is a little bit like It's a Wonderful Life, where they only have so much money and everybody's standing there screaming. So a little bit for you, a little bit for you, a little bit for you, and they get a pallet with a few of those things on it. So changing your business model to a model where you acquire quickly, early in an emergency, the products that customers are demanding while they're still on the ground, while they're available, and then distributing them as the emergency goes on. And we've done this with natural disasters. We've obviously done it with the pandemic. We've done it with mining spills, but I'd say for any of our customers, having a supply chain that's diverse and resilient. So not every item am I the right supplier for. And a lot of times for us, even during the pandemic, it was just telling the customers, well, I have contracts with this guy. Oh, they're a really good company. You should have a contract with them. There's things you'll get from them you won't get from me. And then you had, Bob's T-shirt shop that said, wire me $1 million and I'll get you some
masks.
ingredients from wherever. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know about that. I don't know Bob's T-shirt shop. You might want to think hard about that. Anyway.
Well, I mean, it's actually interesting that, you are also a supply chain and a procurement organization, essentially, because you've got to be really responsive to be getting all these supplies to be able to then place into the system to be able to respond to the needs of your customers as well. And without that, then you would struggle, because you would struggle to respond to all these requests. And I'm sure you have data on kind of this is the average number of disasters. I mean, it sounds bad to say it like that, but you see kind of generally kind of things need to be where they need to be, and things happen throughout the year. But without that agility, it's harder for you to be able to support your customers when they have an emergency they need your help with.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if we're a $300 million company, that means we're buying,
Mhm.
whatever, 250 million or whatever, you do the math.
Yeah.
And our strategy is just like what you heard from Tammy. I mean, we really value long-term relationships. And of course we care about what we pay for things because our customers care about it. But in an emergency, it's really good to be in with people that you already know. Another thing is a lot of these emergencies are a little more foreseeable, especially natural disasters.
Yeah.
So if we're going into the weekend, for example, mobilizing the supply chain, contacting people, doing a quick touch base on what's going on. And you're right, we track climate related disasters, which are really the big thing. And, let's be honest, the places where most Americans want to live, Florida, Texas, and California, they've always gotten a lot of weather. So,
Yeah. No.
but it seems like lately there's even more. So,
Yeah, I mean, here in Florida, and you're always keeping an eye on the hurricanes, for example, when they're going to hit. And previously, we were talking off mic. I lived in Southern California, and in basically the last subdivision on the side of a national forest. So we were evacuated a couple of times for wildfires, and when the temperatures rose and the humidity dropped, that now's the time to kind of keep your eye out and be a bit more diligent. So I'm sure those are cues, at least for you to that you keep an eye on because it changes the probability that something might occur.
yeah, and sometimes you can't sometimes you can't get product in. So South Florida, for example, when we've had really major hurricanes there, if the airport shut down and everybody's
Mhm.
evacuating, you're not going to be able to get things in by ground. So some of our better customers, prior to the emergency, they're looking at what they have and what they might need. And we're actually moving product 2 and 3 days before the emergency. So in a natural disaster, logistically, you may lose 3 days where you can't physically get product into that area. So it's really important to have those conversations in advance of what they might need and how we might get it there. And in some cases, we move it local in one of our warehouses, or the customer will make a decision. Hey, we're going to go ahead and make this purchase and get it to us before the storm actually hits. But yeah, our customers in South Florida, sometimes I feel like, when we see the guy on the Weather Channel that
Yeah.
you picked, and he's kind of like, I feel like I don't see my customers standing there with them because they're out there all the time.
Yeah.
So you wait, Florida is always dealing with these. And by the way, they're fabulous at dealing with emergencies.
Yeah, they are.
We'll know from one emergency to the next, what the requirement is going to be. And so even people that are super prepared always run into those things they never thought about. And Katrina, it was, chest waders and hip
Yeah.
waders. And so every single emergency has its own kind of characteristics and flavor.
Now, Tammy, you talked about due diligence earlier. I'd love to understand kind of from a due diligence perspective, what can you do to understand, whether a potential partner has the ability to respond quickly, before an actual event happens?
Yeah.
What kind of questions you ask, or what kind of things do you look into that gives you the confidence that, yes, I know they're going to be able to respond?
Right. Well, one of the things you want to make sure they have the financial wherewithal just to be able to purchase this product up front and be able to deliver it. And one of the struggles we had in my own city is that my city council justifiably wanted me to contract more with small and local
Yep.
businesses, which I totally agree
Yeah.
with. However, during a big emergency like the fires, many of those mom and pop businesses were closed or their
Yep.
places burned down. Or
Yep.
so the one good thing about going with a national big brand company, big box company, is they have more resources. So even if Safeware locations within Southern California are also impacted, Safeware has locations all over the United States. So those folks and those products can come in as well. So in setting up my emergency contracts, I primarily went with bigger companies
Mhm.
only because I knew they had resources from all over that they could help. Rick also made a great point about the warehousing. There was a trend about a decade ago for procurement to start getting rid of their warehouses. It was, we don't need to pay these rents
Yeah.
anymore, or these
Just
old
in
buildings
time,
are filling
everything.
with stuff. Everything's
Yeah.
covered with dust anyway. And so, in fact, I was given a mandate. I had 4 warehouses and I was told to close them all. And I'm
Mhm.
like, well, wait a minute. Let me go find where these warehouses are. I'm a brand new purchasing agent and let me see what we actually keep. Well, I actually came back with a recommendation and said, okay, I can close 2 out of the 4, but 2 of these are pretty important for police and fire. We need to house some of their stuff. And luckily, when the fires broke out, we had those 2
Yeah.
warehouses. Well, a lot of agencies have reduced their warehousing or got rid of it. And then when an emergency happens, they had nothing on hand. And because we've always relied on the suppliers, next day, same day deliveries, going to come to my desktop. Well, that didn't happen, particularly during the pandemic. And now warehousing is making a big comeback
Yeah.
as governments realize I need to start stocking some of this stuff. So I love what Rick said about the warehousing because governments really have done a 180 on that as well.
I think that the pandemic did a lot of things for helping people realize what supply chain and procurement actually does. That, before then it was very much, there was this assumption, and you took for granted that things would be where you wanted them, when
course.
you wanted them.
Yeah,
Um,
purchasing is invisible until
Yeah.
it's not.
Right.
I think nobody cares how things magically get there. The Amazon package is on the doorstep, but nobody thinks, how did it get there?
Uh,
We talked about during the one of the recent purchasing conferences that, in our business, we deal with the heroes, right? The police, the fire, and everybody applauds. And after the pandemic, our healthcare workers. But, we worked with these procurement folks that were in the trenches, and they really were heroic. And there's a strong sense of conscience and a strong sense of duty. And, these folks worked around the clock. They did an amazing job. And it happens with every emergency because, like I said, the first thing they do when they activate the EOC is they start bringing procurement folks in on it. It's not just in government. We talk about government. Our largest industrial customers are in the arborist business. So for every good reason, right? It's the same type of thing, right? When some storm happens, they're cutting trees and they know they can reach out to us on the weekend. So, they always want to get the better price, but they also know they need a supply chain that's resilient, that's going to be there for them after an emergency. So I love the shout out to our purchasing folks because, I've seen it firsthand. I mean, they do amazing work. And so for us, we just want to be an arrow in their quiver. Somebody like the Tammy on the landline, phone's not working, cell phone's not working. Who are you going to call? And that's really our business model.
Yeah. Well,
And when we're talking about emergencies, I know we're thinking hurricanes, fires, the big stuff, but I mean, a procurement deals with emergencies. There's a leaky classroom roof in this school, and I need to get it fixed before the summer vacation. I can't wait till summer vacation to tear off the roof. Or, in my case, a drunk driver on a Saturday night came through one of my community service centers and took off half the center. Well, my council member said, Tammy, I want that reopened in 2 weeks. To me, that's an emergency, even though it's just one little location I'm dealing with. So purchasing is always dealing with emergencies. Sometimes it's an emergency from a politician and they think it's an emergency. Maybe not so much an emergency, but we still have to respond because it's our political bosses. We have to respond.
It's made into an emergency.
Everybody's always screaming for something, and you have to delineate who's the boy who calls whoop, cries whoop, and what's a real emergency. So there's a lot of that going on with procurement too.
I mean, I had the privilege of meeting some of the police officers who were involved in the investigation to rescue Lady Gaga's dog when it got, kidnapped. So you're right. I mean, it becomes an emergency no matter what. One thing that's happening out there now a lot is flooding. And not all the floods are the big national news, but also, water supply. I mean, didn't used to be a big call. It's not a lot of money, but all of a sudden people are finding out, hey, our drinking water is unsuitable. And so, all of a sudden they need truckloads and truckloads of water. So I echo what Tammy said. I mean, there's those high profile national news emergencies, but, government. And one thing we learned during the pandemic is if the businesses don't meet the demand, who are people going to call? They're going to call the city. They're going to call the county. Hey, we can't get this. We don't have that. Right. And so, but it's not always national news.
Well, I want to wrap up just with a question that I'll pose to both of you. So, Tammy, I'll ask this to you first, then over to Rick. The question is kind of any overarching advice based on all the things that we've talked about today that you have for whether it's from a contracting perspective or a relational perspective that, we really need to lean on in a crisis, or we need to kind of do the groundwork and due diligence for, so that it exists when you need to pick up that phone and call for help.
Yeah. One of the things that I found very powerful when I became a purchasing agent was my meetings with suppliers.
Mm.
And I routinely met with suppliers because procurement, we know a little bit about a lot of stuff, but we don't know in depth any one industry. And so meeting with suppliers on a regular basis really helped me educate me about their industry, what's coming up, what's on the horizon, what have they done for other agencies similar to mine. And I also would suggest for procurement, we shouldn't be so prescriptive. We are so big into writing our specifications
Mhm.
and spelling out exactly what we want. Well, sometimes the suppliers might have a whole nother product or a service that could solve this problem either easier or
Yeah.
simple. We
Fraction
don't
of the
even know
price.
about it. So
Yeah,
maybe describe the problem and let the suppliers come forward with the solutions.
I love that. Thank you, Tammy. Rick.
So I'm the mirror image. I have the same outlook, but in reverse. So for us, our advice would be construct a supply chain in advance, build relationships with the suppliers. We're not going to let a good customer down if there's an emergency. You might be competing actually with neighboring municipalities. Hopefully, we never get to a point where it's a whole country again. But the first time that you speak with a supplier, you wouldn't want it to be just in that time of crisis. So our
Yeah.
best customers work with us regularly, and we have that, kind of relationship where we're constantly hearing from them. And so I think that's really one of the big takeaways for us. I think the contracting is a key point. Establishing the prices in advance. In our world, you're going to be audited on those prices later. So having the right contract, having the right pricing is very important. But and then hold the suppliers accountable. After the pandemic, we were participating in a working group, which was one of the honors of my career. It was all government folks and a couple of suppliers, and we talked about how do you construct a resilient supply chain. And one of the things, and Tammy kind of touched on this, that I tried to emphasize is you can hold suppliers accountable for a lot of things you don't hold a supplier accountable for right now. So things that people hold us accountable for might be, hey, we're worried about having traffic flares in an emergency. We want you to stock this amount, as part of this fulfillment contract that we're going to give you or this agreement. So I think we can work together towards mutual goals rather than just waiting till the heat of the moment and work towards those goals mutually. I mean, we have every commercial incentive to support our best customers with things like inventory, responsiveness after hours. So I think a lot of that can be determined in advance and smooth out the actual event for our customers.
Yeah, it was great advice, and really pulling it together from both of you is investing in strategic partnerships. Looking at this as, how do I build those relationships up front, and how do I look at building win-win relationships? And
I mean, purchasing is buying, suppliers are selling. It's a
yeah,
symbiotic relationship. We gotta need each other.
and yet we are often brought up to see each other as the enemy.
Exactly. And I understand during a formal procurement, there is a line and we each need to stay on our side of the fence. But outside of that, we can talk all the time and collaborate.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Tammy and Rick, for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. What I'm going to do is I'll put links to both of your LinkedIn profiles on the
Okay.
show notes for today's episode in case anybody would like to reach out directly. We'll also link up both to the Safeware website and also National Cooperative Procurement Partners websites. Those are all going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. For anyone who's listening, that's artofprocurement.com/podcast. You'll see this podcast and all the others that we publish right there. So one last time, Tammy, Rick, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. I feel like I'd like to hang out and talk to you guys for a little bit longer offline. This is very energizing, so I really appreciate it. Thank you both, and this was cool.
Thank you.
Thanks.